For women, it pays off to be thin. That's because obese women tend to earn far less than their skinnier peers. Alice Fulwood is a Wall Street reporter for The Economist, and she wrote an article about the economics of thinness. Alice, does being thin as a woman help you to become rich in a way that it doesn't for a man?
Yeah, so this was the sort of central question of a piece that I wrote a little while ago. And the reason that I started thinking about this was that I saw this sort of very interesting chart. At the time, it was sort of published by the Centers for Disease and Control in America. And basically, it plotted household income against BMI, body mass index, which is sort of a measure of weight, obesity, fatness. It's a flawed measure, but it's sort of easy to calculate. And so people tend to sort of use it for that reason. And what it showed is that, in every developed country, or what it showed is that there was a downward sloping relationship between weight and income. The richer people are, the thinner they tend to be. And this actually holds true for sort of every developed country as well. I sort of looked up Eurostat data for most European nations, and it tends to show the same thing. What was interesting about this plot is that it teased out men and women. And it showed that actually there appears to be no relationship at all between weight and income for men. That relationship is sort of basically flat. Rich men are just as likely to be obese or just as likely to be thin as their poorer peers. But for women, there is this sharply downward sloping negative relationship. So rich women are much, much thinner than their poorer peers. And this really got me thinking about what could be driving this outcome, because people have tended to think about the relationship between weight and income as probably running from income to weight, if that relationship is causal. Being rich, people have easier access to fresh vegetables. They can exercise more. They're more educated about how to maintain their weight. But if the relationship only holds for women and not for men, you have to think that something else is going on here.
Right, so we can conclude basically that women are penalized in the workforce for being women, and then on top of that, they are penalized for being overweight.
Yes, so, on the basis of this chart alone, you have to be a bit careful about sort of drawing inferences about discrimination. But I, saw this sort of initial data, and then you can go sort of and read the academic literature on this topic, which looks at things like whether there are wage penalties for, for gender or for weight, appearance in general. And, the studies have sort of different orders of magnitude. Some of them find different effects. But there is a sort of core of the literature that seems to find that overweight women in the workplace are penalised. They tend to earn less than their thinner peers, but there doesn't seem to be as much of a penalty for men. Some papers find a sort of small effect. In general, it's sort of less than the impact on women, but in general, either no effect or a much smaller impact for overweight men than there is for overweight women.
And when we talk about the gender wage gap, we can say for every dollar a man earns, a woman earns 77 cents. That's the global World Bank figure, for example. And if thin women make more money over time than women in bigger bodies, do we know how much money that adds up to over time?
Yeah, so you can get estimates of the sort of potential wage penalty. And, I do want to be a bit careful here. The gender wage gap in particular, it doesn't necessarily entirely reflect discrimination against women, right? It's on average, women earn sort of this income and men earn this income, and people do different jobs. They have different qualifications, they have different levels of experience. That's the sort of overall gap. And there are lots of reasons why that exists. And, you think that it's bad. But what we're sort of talking about with the discrimination penalty for weight, or the weight penalty here, is that if you control for all of those things, if you control for education and experience and sort of any other factor that you think might influence somebody's wages, overweight women tend to earn. And this is, in the US, in Europe, various different studies between sort of 7 to 10% less than their thinner peers. And by overweight here, I mean, you're using the sort of broad definitions of BMI. So a BMI above 30 versus somebody who has like a BMI in the normal range, which is, 18 and a half to 25.
Right, and in your work, you use data from France, for example, that shows obese and thin men in France tend to earn about the same, but obese women are less likely to be high earners than thinner women. I'm wondering, do we know what this trend looks like in emerging economies like India, for example?
Yeah, so there's actually a very different relationship in emerging countries. It's only in developed nations that being sort of richer is associated with being thinner. In emerging markets, you still see the sort of same relationship that you saw in developed countries maybe sort of 100 and 150 years ago, which is that as people earn more income, they tend to have sort of more access to food in general. And therefore, the line actually slopes upwards in emerging markets. So in EM countries, the rich people are the sort of the heavier they tend to be, and that's partly because you have people at the lower end of the income distribution who have face actual food scarcity. They sort of can't earn enough to get sort of enough to eat, and that relationship is how things sort of existed in developed countries a long time ago. But over the last sort of century or so, as societal norms around body standards and beauty standards have sort of come to have an impact on society, you've seen that relationship sort of shift to this downward sloping relationship that we're seeing now. And that's become sort of particularly acute over the last 50 years as obesity has become more of a problem.
So in rich countries, then being thin essentially becomes almost an economic investment in yourself, you could almost say. So how do these new weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy fit into that picture?
Yeah, I think this is a sort of really good point that I want to dwell on for just a second, which is that I think when people think about women and beauty standards and their appearance, people often think that women are, maybe being vain, or they're influenced by magazines or social media to think that they have to look a certain way. And what I thought was sort of interesting about approaching it from the perspective of, well, maybe there are economic incentives here. Maybe it's rational for women to be thin. And by doing so, they sort of have much to gain, potentially in the marketplace, in the marriage market and elsewhere. And so once you sort of approach from that issue, you can sort of think about the things that women do to try and be thin, like, go on a juice cleanse or take soul cycle classes or bar classes or whatever it is, as economic investments potentially in their sort of future lives. And you can apply that to any sort of decision that a woman makes about how to look, and it definitely applies to Ozempic. Now, Ozempic is very expensive. It's sort of relatively novel, but it certainly sort of fits into this category of you could in theory consider making that investment, both potentially for health benefits, but also for sort of economic benefits in the labour market as well.
Right, and you mentioned that worldwide obesity has been on the rise. It's more than doubled since 1990. Obesity rates are projected to continue to rise. Do you expect this problem to get worse for women in the future?
Yeah, so this is sort of quite a nuanced point, but I think that the science is pretty clear that being sort of very obese does come with additional health costs. So there are sort of lots of comorbidities. You're more likely to have diabetes, you're more likely to have heart disease, sort of other health problems that, it's completely rational to try and avoid those, right? And at the same time, you sort of have a rising prevalence of obesity. So I don't, want the discussion about these sort of potential penalties that women face in the labour market to be taken as, saying that it's completely fine to be sort of very, very obese, and there should be sort of, any action people take to remedy that must be because of this economic incentive. I think there are lots of other incentives going on here that might make people want to go on Ozempic and want to sort of help, any of the problems that are associated with obesity. That said, I do think that, being a woman in the world, you feel a lot of pressure to look a certain way and arrange your life such that you can sort of achieve some body standard or beauty standard. And it can be sort of quite exhausting. And I think that, framing it in this way can help people to sort of think through what's really going on here more clearly. That said, I do think that sort of rising obesity rates are a problem. And I think that, it is a sort of good scientific breakthrough that we seem to have sort of some drugs that might be able to combat this, because as you say, it's becoming more of a problem, and this could help cut against that.
Thanks for bringing our attention to this issue, Alice.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
As we heard from Alice, women are under immense pressure, even economically, to fit beauty standards. That begs the question, in an age of body positivity and fat acceptance, haven't we moved on? Well, the opposite could be true. A Harvard study found that while biases towards sexual orientation, race, and skin tone decreased in recent years, weight stigma actually increased by 40%. Tessa Charlesworth is one of the authors of the study. Tessa, do we know why weight bias is on the rise?
There are probably a number of factors that might explain why weight bias is uniquely increasing in the United States and internationally. But certainly one of them is that body weight bias, unlike the other biases of sexuality and race, for instance, is seen to be controllable. And so it's therefore a kind of identity that people point to as something that's blameworthy or the responsibility of the identity holder. We just don't say the same things of like, you could change your race if you tried hard enough, or you can change your sexual orientation. We no longer really say that in society. And so because it seemed to be controllable, because it seemed to be blameworthy, people seem to be increasingly stigmatizing those people who aren't changing their body weight.
Right, and besides Alice's point about earnings, how is this weight bias reflecting in the workplace, for example?
Yeah, so any kind of bias that we see in society, whether that's about race or sexuality or body weight, is going to also impact the kinds of experiences people have in the workplace. So it's going to impact things like discrimination at work in the sense of microaggressions, for instance. So subtle comments or moments of hostility that people experience. And that can be as simple as, talking about, oh, why aren't you working out? Or why aren't you eating a salad? Little comments like that can show up not just in society, but they also show up in the workplace to create these kinds of hostile environments for people to live in. Another way that weight bias can show up in the workplace is obviously like pay and promotion discrimination. So as I mentioned, with the kinds of attributions we make about people that are overweight or in larger bodies, because we think that they're not changing their bodies and they should be changing their bodies, we also make the attribution that they're lazy or that they're just not trying hard enough. And because of that, they are often penalized in terms of pay and in terms of performance evaluations at work.
And right now there is a big body positivity movement on the way. Plus-size models, for example, are making strides in the fashion industry. The term fat is being normalized. Is that not making a difference?
We hope so. It might be too early to tell. When you even look back at some of the large-scale social movements like Black Lives Matter or the same-sex marriage movement, for instance, it sometimes takes a while for those to trickle through the rest of the population, even if we have some sort of pioneers or harbingers who are creating these movements and creating these changes. For that to become a new norm often takes some time. So it could be that there are, competing forces between these kinds of control perceptions that I talked about earlier and the fat positivity movement, that if we didn't have the fat positivity movement, we could be in a much worse position than we actually are. But the place that we are today, I hope, will become better in the future because of these kinds of movements, because of the kinds of changes and representations that you mentioned.
And what about the relationship between weight bias and misogyny? Do we know how closely those two are related, interlinked?
Yes, absolutely. So what you're pointing to is like a whole area of psychological research called intersectionality, which is that weight bias or bias in general doesn't affect everyone equally. So there's a huge intersection of weight bias and gender bias or misogyny, where women typically have stronger standards of what their bodies should look like, and therefore often experience more body weight bias, especially internalized body weight bias. Men too experience body weight bias. We also have these norms about men should look a certain way, especially about muscle mass and so on. But because of our more broad societal standards of gender, such that men are supposed to be strong and large and powerful, whereas women are supposed to be small and meek and charming, there are just these baseline differences such that women experience a lot more of those body norms than do men typically. But I should also mention, it's not just intersecting with gender, it's also intersecting with other things like race and social class. So we also see that there are different perceptions such that, white people may perceive less body weight bias, whereas Black people may perceive more. And similarly, across social class, we also know because of the differences in healthy food access and food deserts and so on, that people in lower social classes often have to struggle more with these kinds of body weight experiences and body weight stigmas. And so in addition to gender, we also have to think of all of these other intersections with other kinds of group dimensions that are shaping and coloring the body weight bias experiences.
Right, and earlier we spoke about weight loss drugs like Ozempic that are really at the center of weight loss debates at the moment. Do you expect overweight people to perhaps get even more marginalized now that these drugs are on the market?
Yeah, I think exactly what we were talking about earlier in terms of this key factor of control or the perceived controllability of body weight is now being amplified by Ozempic and these new weight loss drugs. Because now it seems like it's even easier than it was before to just change your body, right? So why aren't you doing it? If you can just take a drug, then why aren't you doing it? So again, these are kind of amplifying that perceived blameworthiness or the perceived control that we have or perceiving about other people. And so I think, I should also mention with these drugs, there's a huge disparity in access because they're not covered by insurance, especially in the United States and in every place. And so again, we have this issue of there's going to be this perceived control of you should just take the drugs, but not everyone would be able to take those drugs even if they wanted to, and especially across racial and class lines. So I think there's a number of factors that these drugs are going to amplify in terms of previous biases.
And you mentioned the presence of these biases in the workplace. Are there any methods that employers can use, for example, to combat weight bias in the workplace?
Yeah, great question. The combating question is always the hardest one because it has been the least studied, actually. So one of the key ways to do is what I would call an organizational audit around your bias. So just as you might do this with your financial records, do this with your social climate of your university or of your company more generally. And that means looking at the kind of language you might have in company policies, looking at the kind of language that's just out there in your everyday conversations, the kind of water cooler conversations. What are the subtle things that people are saying? You can also audit things like the posters around your workplace. So if they're all posters that are of very thin people, doing happy, healthy, like outward things, then maybe think, can we increase the representation of those posters, for instance? So there are lots of subtle ways that you can do by just systematically auditing your environments and your policies to try and reduce those kinds of microaggressions and reduce those kinds of hostile climates.
Tessa Charlesworth, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.